had passed away that day. And he was a water carrier. In other words, his outer seed was unbelievably simple. And nobody had any idea who he was. So he was, okay, a water carrier died. What's the rush? The same day in Palos, there was a Levai for a big Vir, a big Oishir. And you have to remember, by most Yidden, when you have a Levai, you have a Spadim. So they put him in the Kabbalah Shtibel. They put him into the Beis HaMedrash that belongs to the undertakers, to the Chavre Kadisha, and they left him there. And the whole day they were busy with this Oishir. And finally, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, they said, there's another body to bury. They went, they took his remains, and they did a dara, whatever they did, they buried him. Now, again, I don't know halachas, but apparently you're not allowed to name an after person lost the chestimas hagoylu. So Tzemach Tzedek was pashat waiting for them to bury this Shmuel, the Reb Shmuel, the Rav Reb Shmuel, and only afterwards was he able to give him a name after him. So this is why the bris was so delayed. This is the bris from the Reb Marash. Now you should know that even though the Tzemach Tzedek said explicitly that the Rebbe Marash is not named after Shmuel HaNavi, but he says he's named after water carrier in Palos, there are still many Remazim that are Shaykhs to Shmuel HaNavi. The first is the following. Remember, the Rebbe Marash was the youngest of the Tzemach Tzedek's children. Tzemach Tzedek was a gigantic Rebbe, huge Rebbe, thousands of Chassidim. They say he had 1 million Chassidim. 1 million Chassidim in those days is not like 1 million Chassidim today. It didn't mean that 1 million people visited Lubavitch. It means 1 million people were connected to Lubavitch. But Tzemach Tzedek was a very gigantic, great Rebbe. And the Rebbe Marash was his youngest son. The Marash had an incredibly precocious personality. He was one of those kids that he was just so much fun to hang out with. When people came to Lubavitch, they all made it their business to go over to the Junger and Zun, to the Rebbe the Shmuz. He was so interesting. He was so smart. He was so confident, and he was so funny. And the Chassidim enjoyed spending time with him. And he was always around his father, Versteht sich, Tzemach Tzedek. So once Rosh Hashanah, the Tzemach Tzedek was saying the Maftir, the first day of Rosh Hashanah, which is, of course, the story of Tfilas Chana and Nevuas Chana, right? Where Chana comes and she davens. And then, of course, the Rebbe Shmuel HaNavi is born. And then she praises the Eibishter for the gift of this Tzaddik, Zera Nashim, Shmuel HaNavi. And she leaves him in the Beis HaMikdash ad olam. 50 years he served the Jewish people. And of course, the way the story goes, that the first time she came, Eli HaNavi, Eli HaShoifet, who was a Kohen Gadol, he thought that she was drunk, and he reprimanded her for acting drunk. And she said, no, I'm not drunk. I bet I know the story in the Navi. So she came back 2 years later to bring her son and leave him permanently in the Beis HaMikdash. So she went over again to Eli HaNavi, Eli HaShoifet, and she said to him, Chai Hashem, I forgot the pasuk, Chai Hashem, V'chei nafshecha. And she told him, El Hanar Hazeh Hispalot. This is the boy that I remember I came 2 or 3 years ago and you criticized me and you called me shikir. This is the child that I davened for. So the Tzemach Tzedek said the Haftarah of Rosh Hashanah. And he said the word, El Hanar Hazeh Hispaloti. Those who were close by saw that he pointed at the Rebbe Marash. He pointed at the Rebbe Marash. So apparently there was some connection between the Rebbe Marash and Shmuel HaNavi, even though he's named after somebody else. And the second connection is really very compelling. It's a very strong connection. And this we know from the Rebbe's Rishimis. It wasn't revealed after Gimel Tammuz, that the Rebbe Marash suffered from a lot of illnesses. He was very sick. And he hid them from his father. He didn't want his father to know. I mean, people explained to me that he had leukemia. Somebody told me that the symptoms that are described, that in his blood he had white pus, that he had leukemia. And he didn't want his father to know because he didn't want his father to have his nefesh. Eventually his father found out, but by that point he was so ill that it was much harder. Tzemach Tzedek was not going to help him as a doctor, it was going to help him as a Rebbe, it was more difficult. And the Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, said, as I should, I didn't know sooner. If I would have known earlier, I would have been able to give you more arichas yamim. And then he said, I wish you should live at least the years of Shmuel HaNavi, which is 52. The Poil, the Rebbe Marash lived only 48 years. And there's a remes. You may say no Bohem. Bohem is 47. Imakoil is 48. People continuously pointing out that I've made a mistake. Bohem is 47, but the Rebbe Marash lives 48. There's B'mei Shana Bahem, and then the Shiva Mishon, and then the Shmei Nishon. The Marash lived 48 years, lived 4 years shy of Shmuel HaNavi. And if you're familiar with the Rishimus of the Rebbe, you know that the Rebbe Marash was actually supposed to live more. He gave up his life so the pogroms in Russia should stop. I don't know if I'll have time to get to that part of the story, but he actually ended his life. I mean, the way a Rebbe does, earlier, the pogroms should stop in Russia. That was 1882 at the time. The Rebbe Marash was a wunderkind. He was an extraordinary child. Everything about him was special. He was beautiful. He was very, very smart, incredibly smart, and so confident. He had such confidence and such happiness of life that he was just a contagion. He was the kind of kid who just raised everybody above him around. He was a shtifer. You know, we know, if you're familiar with the Lubavitcher Rabbeim, some of the Lubavitcher Rabbeim were never children. You know, the Rebbe Rashab was never a child. The Rebbe's mother said about the Rebbe he was never a child. But some of the Rabbeim played around when they were little kids. We know from the Friedrich Rebbe that he played around. We know from the Tzemach Tzedek that he played around. And the Rebbe Marash was also that type of a kid. He also had fun. And he even knew how to make trouble. He knew how to make trouble. The Rebbe Marash shtifet, hafreilicher azah. So there are a few stories about his childhood that we know. One of the stories is that there was a Yid, a Gvir, a rich man, who traveled a lot for business, and he became very friendly with the Rebbe Marash. Like I said before, if you visited Lubavitch, one of the stops was the Rebbe Zun. You wanted to speak to this boy because there was something about him that was just so special. Anyway, he discovered that the Rebbe Marash had a hobby. The hobby of the Rebbe Marash was that he used to carve. He had carving tools. The Rebbe Marash was a very exact, precise man. Carving tools, and he used to carve out of wood, out of clay, out of stone, different kind of shapes and forms. As a child, it was a hobby. As an adult and as a Rebbe, he did it for health. He suffered a lot with his fingers, with dexterity in his fingers. So doctors told him that he has to do fine motor work to keep the nerves working in his fingers. So he used to do carvings even as a Rebbe. Amongst the carvings that he did as a Rebbe was that in Lubavitch, in the Zal, the great Kleiner Zal, the great Zal, they had chandeliers. Handmade chandeliers from the Rebbe Marash. And apparently the craftsmanship was perfect. The Rebbe Marash also made a number of Megillas. I think he made 6 Megillas, Megillas Esther, and they're extant. People actually have the actual Megillah that the Rebbe Marash wrote, B'Ksav Yad Kodshei, and he gave it to each one of his sons and each one of his son-in-laws. And some of these Megillas are extant. There's a mishpacha that actually has shown pictures of this Megillah of the Rebbe Marash. And he did all kinds of things using his hands. Of course, you all know that we visit the Rebbe's room. If you walk into the Rebbe's room, diagonally across from the door, there is a round table that's always covered with a plastic and a shmat and a cloth from bima for kisatera. That table was handmade by the Rebbe Marash, handmade. And again, I tried to peek under the table to see the craftsmanship. I'm not much of a maven in craftsmanship, and there wasn't much to see because it's covered almost till the floor. But people said the craftsmanship is perfect. This table belonged to a Yid in Paris. The Rebbe Marash had a son whose name was Menachem Mendel, who spent the last years of his life in France, many years in France. His children lived in France, and somebody had this table, and he gave it to our Rebbe to bring with him to New York when he came back with his mother in 1947 to give it to the Friedrich Rebbe. The Rebbe took it back with him, but he kept it in his room. It didn't go upstairs, it stayed by the Rebbe. The Rebbe had it in his room all the years of his Nesias. So before he became a Rebbe, this table, there was Maisa Yidei from the Rebbe Marash. So the Marash had this hobby to carve. So this businessman found out that the Rebbe Marash has a hobby, so he decided that he's going to buy him a gift. So on one of his travels, he came to a market, and he found a very fancy carving tool with many, many gadgets that could make all kinds of different interesting shapes and so on. And he brought it with him to Lubavitch. And he went over to the Rebbe Marash, as was his custom. And he started opening up the knife to show the Rebbe Marash just how many different things you can do with this tool. It was a very sophisticated tool. And he says to the Reb Marash, I bought this for you. You can have it if you can answer one question. And the question is, who is God? Where is God? So when this businessman asks the Rebbe Marash, he was a little boy, he asks him the question, who is God? So the Rebbe Marash, without looking up, put his hand in his pocket and pulls out his own carving knife, which was much less sophisticated and far fewer gadgets. And he also opens it up as if he's showing this man these little tools. And then he says to him, "Und du kennst das haben, ad du wirst mir sagen, wo ist nicht." He said to this businessman, you can have my tool if you can tell me where he isn't. And of course, the Rebbe Marash got his knife. It's a story of the Rebbe's childhood. In the Hayom Yom of today, of course, you have the famous Maisa. Tzemach Tzedek had a habit of visiting the Cheder. There was a Cheder that was exclusive for Beis Harav. Exclusively for Beis Harav. Exclusively for Beis Harav. And only the Tzemach Tzedek's children and grandchildren went in that Cheder. I think the Malama's name was Reb Pesach, but I could be wrong. And the Tzemach Tzedek visited often, I think once a week. And he would had all of his grandchildren and what they were learning. And they sat different ages together. So on one occasion, Tzemach Tzedek came in, and the Marash was sitting with his nephews. He understands the Marash's brothers had children older than him. The Marash was born, he probably had a dozen nephews and nieces at the moment of his birth. And Tzemach Tzedek comes into the Cheder and he's asking questions. And the Marash did incredibly well. So the Malamed couldn't believe it. And he said, aha, mach gut, he's doing so well. So the Tzemach Tzedek said famously, was is the Pelle, was is the Wunder, as Tiferes Shebe Tiferes macht gut. Why are you so surprised that Tiferes Shebe Tiferes is doing well? The Marash Yemaledes is Tiferes Shebe Tiferes, and his Inyan is Tiferes Shebe Tiferes. Why are you surprised as Tiferes Shebe Tiferes macht gut? One of the more interesting stories, which is in the Rebbe's Reshimis, is that Marash was a troublemaker. He sat in class with his nephews, who were older than him in some cases. But he was so much, and by the way, they were Rebbe's, some of these people. They were incredibly intelligent. But the Rebbe Marash was even more intelligent. The Marash sat in the back of the room. He was always fidgeting. So we had a little pocket watch. And he was taking it apart and putting it back together. He was very, very good with mechanics. Very, very good at mechanics. And by the way, later as a Rebbe, he actually used to make his own medicines. He studied medicine. And when he needed to take a medicine, he didn't go to the store and buy a medicine. He bought the chemicals, the compounds, and he would mix the medicines himself. He had an idea in a lot of things, that Marash. So he's sitting in the back of the room playing with the watch. The Malamed asks a question. And none of the children know the answer. And the Rebbe Marash says, I know the answer, but I'm not going to say. And in effect, he was making fun of his nephews, that they're dumb. So the next day, his older brother came to the Cheder. His older brother was the Maharil. He was a Gon and a Tzaddik and a Kodesh. And the Filik writes about him, Admo. And he came into the Cheder and he said to the Malamed that the Malamed shows favoritism to his brother. In other words, he doesn't treat the kids equal. The Marash gets away with stuff that others don't get away with. And of course, if I was the Malamed, I would do the same thing. The Rebbe Zun. So the Marash made a comment about the fact that he's sitting in a class with a bunch of dumbbells. I understand that these dumbbells were geniuses, but just compared to him. And he said something like, as they've been seeing the Balagol zogt, was größer der hinten als mehr fed. In other words, they're bigger than me, but they're mehr fed. So the Maril was insulted. And he says, ooh, anas ponim. He turns to his younger brother, who was close to 20 years his junior, 15, 16 years younger than him. Chutzpahnik. So the Rebbe Marash says, Brudel, der von Kabel des Avicha Vesimecha gedenkst du. Aber der von Adeshem Lakecha Tira aus den ganzen vergessen. Right? There's different opinions. But the S is an extra word. Kabel es Avicha Vesimecha, one of the Ifanim is that from S you learn that you have to respect your older brother. But Hashem Lakecha Tira, the Gemara says, teaches you Rabbis Talmidei Chachamim. So the Rebbe Marash says to his older brother, you're complaining, how come I'm not Makayim the S of Kavod to respect you because you're my older brother. What about I'm a bigger Talmid Chacham as a kid? This was the Rebbe Marash. This was the Rebbe Marash. Extraordinary child. And he was very loved by everybody who knew him and saw him. One of the other stories that happened, I'm sorry, I just looked at my notes. One of the other stories that happened during the Marash's childhood, which is very interesting, and the stories in two different places in Lakuta Devurim, which he knew him, was the following. The Rebbe Marash used to learn Mishnayos Baal Peh. All of the children in the house learned Mishnayos Baal Peh, and the Tzemach Tzedek would give them money for it. And they got a certain amount of money for every Peidik, or every Masechta, or every Seder that they chazed. But they didn't get the money right away. It stayed by the Tzemach Tzedek. There was an account. And when they needed the money, they would come and ask him for money. One day, the Meiches Sfarim comes to Lubavitch. The Sfarim seller came to the Tzemach Tzedek in Lubavitch to sell Sfarim. Now, in those days, when you bought Sfarim, there were two separate things. There were gebundene and nicht gebundene. Sfarim were not sold bound. They were just sold printed. And then you had to bind them. Especially Yidman, there was a bookbinder. It was a separate geschäft. So you had Tzemach Tzedek Sfarim gebundene and nicht gebundene. Some Sfarim were bound, some Sfarim were not bound. And the Sfarim that were bound were kept in open bookcases. The Sfarim that were not bound were kept in closed bookcases. So the Smeichah Sfarim came to Lubavitch. He sold Sfarim to a lot of people. The Tzemach Tzedek bought a ton of Sfarim. I don't know, a bookcase worth many Sfarim. The Rebbe Marash was absolutely obsessed with Sfarim. He loved Sfarim. And he used to read the Hagdomis of the Sfarim. But I used to say, I only read the Hagdom of the Sefer when the Hagdom Alein is a Sefer. I don't read Stam as a Hagdomis, introductions to Sfarim. I only read introduction to the Sefer when the introduction itself is a Sefer. So he came to his father, to the Tzemach Tzedek, and he asked him, I think, for 3 ruble, which was money. Tzemach Tzedek says to him, why do you need the 3 ruble? He says, I want to buy Sfarim. So Tzemach Tzedek says to him, the Sfarim was the host shoin bis the klar. The Sfarim that you already have, you know. So the Rebbe Marash laughs and says, Papa, you got 7 bookcases of open, and 4 bookcases of closed. These numbers are arbitrary. He says, you have so many bookcases of Sfarim that are open, that people could see the books. Then you have so many bookcases that are closed. And you just bought a whole bunch more. He says, do you know all the Sfarim you have? So Tzemach Tzedek said, of course. So the Rebbe Marash said, I can test. He said, sure. So he randomly took out 2 Sfarim. And in different places, it says different names of the Sfarim. One place was a Sefer HaMaslo from one of the Rishonim, a Sefer in Diktuk. And the Tzemach Tzedek repeated verbatim what's written in the Sefer. Another Sefer took a Sefer Mesilas Yesharim, Tzemach Tzedek repeated verbatim. And another place that's different hymns. It was not normal. Tzemach Tzedek knew every Sefer he had in his library by heart, word for word. So the Marash learned, when you buy a Sefer, darf man wissen, was ist wenig. Tzemach Tzedek. You're talking about not normal. Not normal heads. There's another mitzvah that happened in the Rebbe Marash's childhood. Now, the Rebbe Marash had a tragedy in his life. The tragedy in his life was the following, that he married his niece. There's a Rishima called Harabonas Rivka, and in that Rishima it says that there was a bit of a Chalukah between 2 of the brothers, which niece he would marry. There's a mashmos darshan that maybe it created a kpeda. He married his niece, his brother's daughter. And the brother whose daughter he married was Chaim Shneir Zalman. He's the one I mentioned before that the Tzemach Tzedek used to call him Mein Lamden. Of the Tzemach Tzedek's children, he was the biggest Lamden in Nigla. Anyway, right after Sheva Barachas, she got sick. And 3 months later, she passed away. And by the way, now in Lubavitch, I have a friend who's working on redoing the Beis HaChaim in Lubavitch. So they actually found the oil of the Rabbanis, and they actually put up 4 tziyunim to represent the middle Rebbe's Rebbetzin, the Tzemach Tzedek's Rebbetzin. I don't know who else is there, but the 4th one is this. I think her name was Sheina Shterna, the Reb Marash's wife, Beziv Grishin. And she passed away very shortly after the Chassan. He was born Tzadik Dala, the Chasna was the Tafresh Zayin, Tafresh Ches. Now, the Tzemach Tzedek had a minig. Tzemach Tzedek had a custom. The custom was that when he wanted all of his children to remain in Lubavitch. He wanted all of his sons to stay in Lubavitch. And he really didn't, he didn't accomplish it 100%. Because one of his children, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak, married the daughter of the Cherkasser and didn't come back to Lubavitch. He remained in Cherkas, and then he became a Rebbe in Avruch. But the Tzemach Tzedek wanted all of his sons to stay in Lubavitch. And what he would do is, when they would get married, they get married mamish as teenagers, he would build each one of them a house, and next door to it a shul, on one of the streets of Lubavitch. So could you imagine what Lubavitch must have been like during that time? Tzemach Tzedek had 7 sons. They were giants. They were cannons of Torah, Nigla, Nista, and Avodas Hashem. And they all lived in Lubavitch. At least 5 of them lived in Lubavitch. And they each had their own home and their own shul. And when Chassidim would come to Lubavitch to visit the Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, so they all had their favorite. They would come to the Rebbe, Versteitza, and then we'd go to the Rebbe's. Each one had their own address. Some went to the Baruch Shalom, some went to the Maril, some went to Bishol Neach, some went to Chaim Shnei Zalman. And I guess some went to the Rebbe Marash. Because of Yankiv, we don't know much about him, but he moved away. He was a Rav, and he passed away in Arsh, I think. He passed away before the Tzemach Tzedek. And Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak moved away to Avruch, and he became a Polish Rebbe in Avruch. He didn't have a derech of Chabad. So the Rebbe Marash got married. Tzemach Tzedek did the same thing. He built him a house and a Beis Medrash. When his wife passed away, the Rebbe Marash was devastated. He was broken. He was absolutely devastated. And when you read about it, and you know about the Rebbe Marash's personality, you wonder, why was he so upset? I mean, he was such a breite mensch. He was about moichin she'enkel me'el. And the only asbara was that the Rebbe Marash understood that this was his other half, this was his neshama. And he wasn't zeiche to be bein a bias with her, so it's a zivik sheni, it's a very different thing. That's the only way to explain it, but he was completely devastated. The Tzemach Tzedek tried very, very hard to push it, to console him, to be menachem him, to help him come out of his state of avelus, and the Rebbe Marash was devastated. So, b'lev brei, the Tzemach Tzedek made a yitzim min haklal. He called a carpenter, a builder, and they built additional rooms to the Tzemach Tzedek's house, inside the chutzner, where the Lubavitch Haif was, where the Rebbe was, and the shul was, and so on. And the Rebbe Marash moved into those rooms. And the only thing separate the house of the Rebbe Marash and Tzedek was a door. Lived in the same building. 2 years later, the Rebbe Marash got married a second time, and he married a first cousin. And he continued living in the same house with the Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek. The result of this was that even though the Rebbe Marash was the youngest of 7 sons and 2 daughters, and he wasn't stam younger, he was much younger. I mean, the son closest to him in age, I think, was 14 years older than him. Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak, I think, was born Tov Kuf Pei. He was much younger than his brothers and sisters. His children ended up knowing the Tzemach Tzedek more than the cousins who were much, much older, because they lived in the house. And when Tzemach Tzedek became ill at the end of his life, they were mishamish him, they went in every day. So it worked out, so to speak, fortuitously, that the Rebbe Marash, who was the youngest, his children ended up in a certain way knowing the Tzemach Tzedek more than many of their cousins who were much, much older than they were. Now, the story of the second Zivig was that the Mittel Rebbe's wife had a Arichas Yamim. But the Mittel Rebbe passed away. He was 54 years old. His Rebbetzin had Abonis, Hasidkonis, Shena. I wanted to say, I mentioned the four Rebbetzin that are buried in Lubavitch is the Alter Rebbe's Rebbetzin. The Alter Rebbe's Rebbetzin, Rabbanan Satzikon is Sterna. The Middle Rebbe's Rebbetzin, Rabbanan Satzikon is Shena. Tzemach Tzedek's Rebbe, Rabbanan Satzikon is Chayemushka. And the Rebbe Marash Divagrishin all buried in one oil. The Rebbe Tzedivke is also buried in Lubavitch, but they buried it with the men. Anyway, so the Rebbe Tzedek was alive. The Middle Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek Shviger was very much alive. She was a powerful, powerful woman. She was the Middle Rebbe's wife. They had 7 daughters and 2 sons. Tzemach Tzedek had 7 sons and 2 daughters. And from everything I'm able to surmise, the Rebbe's Shena was she was such an outspoken and a strong woman, and her daughters inherited her character. The Middle Rebbe's daughters were powerhouses. They were mamish. Each one of them was an incredibly powerful personality. And she was the matriarch. She was a very strong lady. She lived in Lubavitch. She was the Alter Rebbetzin. She was the Tzemach Tzedek's mother-in-law. When the Rebbe Marash lost his first wife, so she came to her son-in-law, the Tzemach Tzedek, with a request. She said, I didn't want to mix him before. I mixed in Shidduchim. But now we're talking about a Zivik Sheni, the second marriage. I want you to take one of the Yosemim of my daughter, Chaya Sarah, I think her name was. The Middle Rebbe's oldest daughter was Sarah, and the Middle Rebbe's youngest daughter was Sarah, Chaya Sarah. And this youngest daughter was married to a chassid by the name of Reb Aaron Alexanderov. He was the son of also a big chassid. They were mamish tzaddikim. The Rebbe, this Reb Aaron Alexanderov and his Rebbe's and Chaya Sarah were unbelievably holy, pure, beautiful people. But they passed away very, very, very young and left 2 daughters. When they passed away, the daughters, I think, were 8 and 10 or 10 and 12. They were girls, kinderlach. And Rebbe Tzedivke, who was the younger of the 2, described to her grandson, to the Frierdiker Rebbe, in a Reshima, which is now printed, called the Rabbanan Satzikon Rivka, that her early years of life were so unbelievably holy and peaceful and beautiful. And then all of a sudden it was dark. Both the parents passed away. Initially, Reb Aaron Alexanderov's parents adopted them, and it didn't work well. So the Rebbe Shena took them to Lubavitch, and she raised them. So now that the Marash lost his first wife, so she came to the Tzemach Tzedek and said, "Listen, before I didn't mix in. Now it's a Zivik Sheni. You have to take one of Chaya Sarah's daughters. In other words, the Marash, the first cousin." So the Tzemach Tzedek said to his shviga, they played hardball, these people. She says, I have an offer for a shidduch from Dubrovna for 28,000 ruble. 28,000 ruble. It's like millions of dollars. It's a hamoin mit geld for a shidduch. What are you offering? So the Rebbe and Shena said, I don't have 28,000 ruble. Aber ich habe 25 Jahre, I don't know what the cheshbon of 25 Jahre, but that's what she said. I have 25 years of, quote, the wife of a Rebbe is a Rebbe. She was the Middle Rebbe's wife. So she said to him, Ich bin ihm great abzugeben 25 Jahre. If you'll agree to the shidduch, I will give him, that means that Reb Marash, the koyach of 25 years, the wife of a Rebbe is a Rebbe. And the Tzemach Tzedek said, that's a deal. That's a deal. Now they have to make a shidduch. So there's a very poignant Rishima. It's printed now in that Rabbanan Satzikon Rivka, how the 2 girls came in together. The older girl was Gittel, the younger girl was Rivka. And the Tzemach Tzedek wanted the younger one. But he also did not want to embarrass the older one. So he sort of let them figure it out by themselves. And Gittel said to her younger sister, gay. So she was very happy to be Moichel. Her younger sister got married ahead of her, and the Tzemach Tzedek promised that he's going to find for her a good shidduch, and he did find for her a good shidduch. But it wasn't a Rebbe, it was a good shidduch, Nishka Rebbe. That was the story of the second chasana. And they got married, the Rebbe Marash and the Rebbe Tzedivke, and they lived together in this house adjacent to the Tzemach Tzedek. Now understand that the Rebbe Tzedivke didn't have a normal upbringing. She had a very, very good childhood, but when she reached the age where you learn about life, she didn't have parents. So the Rebbe Tzedivke told the Frierdiker Rebbe that when we got married, she said, the Rebbe wasn't only my husband, he was my teacher, Rebbe Marash. She didn't teach him Gemara B'Teisves. She Pasha taught him how to be a balabasta and how to run a home and how to raise children and how to keep books, to keep track of finances. And she would say that everything they did together, the Rebbe Marash was so involved with his family life that everything that was going on in the house, everything that she was responsible for, and everything that he was responsible for, they did as a couple. They were a very, very unbelievable shalom bayis. And the Frierdiker Rebbe said that his grandmother told him, we had 6 kids, and they were boisterous. They were not all tzaddikim, you understand? There was, the oldest was a girl. Her name was Deveda Leah. The youngest was a girl, and her name was Chaya Mushka. And in between the 2 girls, there were 4 boys. And it's hard to know exactly, but let's just assume the oldest was Avram Sender. He passed away at the age of 8, and he's buried in the oil in Lubavitch. There's a tzion for him. The Alter Rebbe said about this Avram Sender, the Mittler Rebbe, no, the Tzemach Tzedek said, about this Avram Sender, he's the neshama of the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe lost 8 years so that Napoleon should be defeated. Imagine that, the Alter Rebbe lost 8 years that Napoleon should be defeated, and his great-grandson, the Rebbe Marash, had a son who was the neshama of the Alter Rebbe. And even though he passed away before Bar Mitzvah, his Matzevit says, Poinitman HaYeled HaTzadik. You don't say about a child that Tzadik. Avram Sender. And this in the pinkets of the Chaver Kadisha, it's Tzaddik and Gadol, but we're going to assume he was the oldest. The second was his name was Shnei Zalman Aaron, the Razor. He was a year and a half older than the Rebbe Rashab. The third, of course, was the Rebbe Rashab, whose name was Shalom Dever. And the youngest was the Menachem Mendel. And the Menachem Mendel was not a year or 2 young. He must have been 6 years younger, because when the Tzemach Tzedek passed away, the Rebbe Rashab was already 5 and a half. And the youngest was a girl, Chaya Mushka. So the Rebbe Sinifke said we had 6 kids, and no one ever raised their voice. No one ever shouted. Imagine. And she was bringing out the Shalom Bayis, especially the peace in the home. And that it was because of the way the Rebbe Marash Pashatzach reingelegt in being madrich and mechanech her, how a Yiddish home should look, and how they work together on making a home of unbelievable peace and holiness. This is a Rebbe and a Rebbe. And of course, then the stories that are interesting was that there were, for many, many years, the Rebbe Marash was very rich. Not for his whole life. When he passed away, he had no money. But for many, many, many years, he had a lot of money. It says in the Rebbe's Hashimis that the Tzemach Tzedek was very into lotteries. He used to buy lotteries. In the Russian government, to make lotteries. And he would buy lottery tickets, and the Rebbe Marash would buy lottery tickets. Parenthetically, Derech Agav, a Yid once asked the Rebbe, it says in Sfarim that any Yid could, if the Eibishter wants, he can have a shidduch. So Yid once asked the Rebbe, what about a Malamed? How is a Malamed supposed to become rich if he's fixed at a fixed income, which he can't get? So the Rebbe said he should buy a lottery ticket. They make a keli for a shidduch. They found that in the Rebbe's Hashimis that the Tzemach Tzedek wrote pidyon. That the lottery should be, he bought a ticket, and the Rebbe Marash bought a ticket, and he wrote a pidyon that the Rebbe Marash should be zeiche. And the Rebbe Marash won several government lotteries. He was very, very, very wealthy. And he had an Hanhoga of Ashidus. He used to buy windows from Italy and furniture from who knows where. He lived in Lubavitch, which was a shtetl full of mud, and his house, in many ways, was pushed a palace. One of the Chassidim, Tzemach Tzedek, it says in the Rishimis, Tzemach Tzedek hat klibayis nicht kein gefarbte, which means the Tzemach Tzedek's furniture wasn't painted. It was raw wood. It wasn't stained. Well, it was sanded, but it wasn't painted. So one of the Chassidim said, Tzemach Tzedek was such a big Rebbe, he's living in furniture. It was a gepast for another man. So he bought the Tzemach Tzedek good furniture that was finished and polished. And he brought it to Lubavitch, which is a huge schlep. There were no trucks, there were no trains, it was done by wagon. When he brought it to the Tzemach Tzedek told him, "Git this Shmuelin. Ich darf das nicht. Give it to my son Shmuel. I don't need it." Because the Tzemach Tzedek also understood that the infant Ashidus, by the Rebbe Marash, was the infant Avoida. So one of the stories was that when the Rebbe Marash traveled a lot, and every time he would travel, he'd bring his wife jewelry. But this wasn't, mom and pop jewelry. This was the best jewelry in the world, from the most expensive jewelry stores in the world. It was worth hundreds of rubles in some cases. The Rebbe Tzedek never used the jewelry. She would get the jewelry, she would pawn it, and she'd get money, and she'd give tzedakah. Each time the Rebbe Marash would return from a trip, he would go to the pawn shop and redeem all the jewelry and give her a new piece of jewelry, and she would immediately take all the old jewelry plus the new jewelry and bring it to the pawn shop and give tzedakah. So of course the Rebbe Talmud Gezok, the Rebbe spoke about it by Fabrengen, that the Rebbe Marash could have given her money. Why did she have to pawn her jewelry? And the Rebbe said it was a inyan for birur. after that sikha, there were women who wanted to give the Rebbe their diamond rings, their jewelry, and the Rebbe sent it back. But the Rebbe brought the Hera. What does a Yiddish woman need jewelry for to be able to give tzedakah? This was the kind of a relationship. The relationship to the Rebbe Marash and the Rebbe Tzedifke was very interesting and very special. The mutual respect, the way he respected her, the way she respected him, was mamish not from this world. There's a story which is mind-blowing, that she went into his room in the evening to talk about something. And when she walked out, she was wearing a nightgown or a robe, and it got caught in the door. So she sat down on the floor and sat the whole night, because she didn't want to disturb her husband to push it to open the door. How long would it take? She understood what it means, a second, by the Rebbe Marash. So she sat down on the floor and waited till he opened the door the next morning, not to disturb her husband, not Stamazoi, her husband, for a split second. This was the chush that they had in derech eretz for each other, as a husband to a wife, and husband to a husband, wife to a husband, was really, really amazing, unbelievable. I mean, I've been talking for over an hour. There's a lot more to tell, obviously. The Rebbe Marash said about himself, Ich hab gehorevet 23,5 Shah mesles und ziet von dem gar nicht gewusst. Which means I would toil for 23.5 hours a day, meaning she would sleep half an hour. And she didn't know anything about it. That was the Rebbe Marash gave the impression of being a businessman. And he had a lot of money, stocks, bonds, business, newspapers. He was always traveling. The fact of the matter was, he never traveled for business. He traveled for askonas. The times that the Tzemach Tzedek were very hard. There were all kinds of tzadis. And the Tzemach Tzedek Taka had 7 sons, but he trusted his youngest. So as young as probably 18 or even younger, the Rebbe Marash started traveling. And officially he was traveling for business, but in reality he was traveling for askonas. And he was all over Eastern Europe. He traveled to many, many places, and he secretly did a lot of inyanim on behalf of his father, for askonas. And of course, one of the famous stories, which everybody knows, which is a Moed de Kamaise, that would repeat itself again 4 generations later, Genoi, with our Rebbe, is that the Rebbe Marash decided to go into Belz. Belz was a gigantic chassidus. The first Belz Rebbe was of Shalom, the Sar Shalom of Belz. He built a shul, which is meant to be like the Beis HaMikdash. And that's why the current Belz Rebbe built in Yerushalayim a shul which is similar to the shul that they had in Belz, which is supposed to be reminiscent of the Beis HaMikdash. So the Rebbe Marash went into Beis HaMikdash with the Belz Rebbe, Belz Rebbe. The Belz Rebbe was blind, couldn't see. So he was being led by 2 chassidim, 2 gaboyim, 2 shalmoshim. When the Belz Rebbe walked to the Beis HaMikdash, he shrugged off the 2 gaboyim and he made a beeline for the Rebbe Marash. And the Rebbe Marash tried to get away, but the chassidim saw that the Belz Rebbe is going after this man, so they didn't let him. And the Belz Rebbe grabbed the Rebbe Marash. Veredus, who is this? So the chassidim around said, he looked, the Rebbe Marash dressed more modern. So however they worded, he's a more modern looking man. He doesn't look like a big chussid, he got goysa pious. And the Rebbe Marash said, and this is the story, by the way, most of this story we don't know from Chabad sources, we know from Belz's sources. The Rebbe Marash Tazagetan, a Jew who's a merchant. So the Belz Rebbe said, yo, this is the best scheda. Taylor is the best scheda. And he wouldn't let go of him until he told him who he was. And he told him that he's the son of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And the Belz Rebbe said, yo, ich seh, I see. And the end of the story was that the Belz Rebbe made the Rebbe Marash give shirayim to the Belz Chassidim. When the Rebbe Marash came back to Lubavitch, he was mishtoimim. He couldn't believe it, that the Belz Rebbe identified him like this. So he told it over to the Tzemach Tzedek. And the Tzemach Tzedek's comment was, was von a offene Balruach HaKodesh as getracht zu behalten. You thought you could hide from someone who was such open Ruach HaKodesh. Like, what were you even thinking? How were you able to hide from such a man? This is the story. Now, I want to end now, but I want to finish with 2 sipurim that has to do with the stalkus of the Tzemach Tzedek. The Rebbe Marash became a Rebbe, and Lubavitch was splintered, torn to pieces. Lubavitch, which had been such a gigantic and organized Hasidus, was divided up into 4. The smallest group of what was left of Lubavitch was Lubavitch. The largest group was Kapus, and then there was Liadi, And then there was Nezhin, and the Rebbe Marash had very few chassidim, especially in the beginning. Most of the chassidim who went to Tzemach Tzedek went away to his brothers. Because the Rebbe Marash was a Niste Pashat, he concealed who he was. So there's two stories when they get to this Tkufa. Uba Agdama, that when the Rebbe Marash passed away, they found a tzava. After the Rebbe Marash passed away, the Tzemach Tzedek writes to him, B'ni harav Shmuel sheyichya, my son Rav Shmuel sheyichya, Re'isi adach shalach, I saw your chassidus, Hutav Eidem Eid, they made me very, very happy. And he adds, like I told you about Peh, what I heard from my Zayda Dal Rebbe. He says, and I'm commanding you, Psach, Picha, V'yo'irud, V'rach, open your mouth and let your words shine. The Tzemach Tzedek left a clear tzavah to the Rebbe Marash that he should become a Rebbe. The Rebbe Marash Pashat concealed it. And one of the most interesting details about the Rebbe Marash is that 6 months before his father passed away, he started saying Chassidus. Tishrei Tafresh Chavav, he started saying Chassidus at the behest of his father. Tzemach Tzedek told him during his lifetime that he should write and say Chassidus. If you look in the Maimorim of Tafresh Chavav, you see that there's already Maimorim that he wrote before his father passed. Now, there are two stories that are contextually relevant. The first is as follows. The Marash and Tzemach Tzedek lived in the same house. And they had a lot of geld, yeah? So people came to take loans all the time. Amongst the people who came to take loans were relatives, nieces, sisters-in-law, cousins. So a woman came into the Rebbe Marash's apartment, and she said to the Rebbe Tzedek, Shmuel, where's your husband? She called him by his name, Shmuel. So the Rebbe Tzedek answered, Bam Shver, he's by the Tzemach Tzedek. She was a member of the family, so without thinking too much about it, she went across, she walked through the door that separated two apartments, and she walked into the Tzemach Tzedek's dina. Tzemach Tzedek lived alone. His wife, his Rebbe, had already passed away, was very quiet. And she comes closer to the Tzemach Tzedek's Yechidus room, and the door's open. And she hears an argument between the Tzemach Tzedek and the Rebbe Marash. Tzemach Tzedek says to his youngest son, sit down on my chair. So the Rebbe Marash says, I can't sit on your chair. And the Tzemach Tzedek said, again, sit down on my chair a few times. And finally he said, I'm commanding you, sit on my chair. Tzemach Tzedek said, if you don't sit on my chair, you're going to suffer. And the Rebbe Marash said, in other words, she overheard the Tzemach Tzedek said to the Rebbe Marash, I want you to sit in my chair, so you should be my successor. And if you refuse to sit in my chair, you're going to suffer. The Rebbe Marash walks out, and she's right there. She heard the whole conversation, which meant that there was a witness who just heard the Tzemach Tzedek coronate the Rebbe Marash. And the Rebbe Marash turns to her and says to her very sternly, "Was du hast jetzt gehört, wird keiner nicht wissen. Und du wirst Mamshech sein, rufen wir Shmuel also wie bis jetzt." He says, the story, what you just overheard, no one's allowed to know. And my name is still Shmuel, not Harav Shmuel, not Reb Shmuel, not Harav Reb Shmuel. You're going to call me the way you called me until now. So she kept the secret until the Tzemach Tzedek. And then she was Mefarsim, the Maise, that she overheard this inyan. And the second Sipur, this is already in follow Khan's Maisis, it's the Maise with Greinim. It's a famous story that when the Marash Tzemach was nostalgic, it was fire in the Lubavitch. You had 5 brothers who were Lubavitch at the time. One of them refused to be a Rebbe, the oldest. Our Rebbe's grandfather's grandfather, who was really entitled to the position, said he's not becoming a Rebbe. He became a Rebbe, a chassid of his youngest brother, the Rebbe Marash. He was mamish 30 years older than him, 28 years older than him, 27 years older than him. And the other 4 were Rebbes, Maril, Marshaz, Marin, Marshaz, and then of course the Rebbe Marash. And they were Kpedis and they were counter Kpedis, and Chassidim was a felach. The brothers amongst themselves got along well, but for the Chassidim was fire. Greinim was a young man, and he didn't know what to do, and he was also very afraid. So he met his mashpia. Who was his mashpia? He had 2 mashpia in Greinim. Greinim's mashpia in Haskalah was a Shmuel Bar Barisvet, the Rashdam. His mashpia in Vos Arum Chassidus is mashpia in Shimusha Shel Teira, in Tzipur Chassidische Tzipurim, Chassidische Werter, was the Zembiner Rav, whose name was Avramke Zemben. His last name was Landa. He was a Zayda of Rabbi Yankov Landa. Rav Yankov Landa and Rabbi Yehuda Leib Landa, the Rabbanim of Bnei Brak. So the Rashdam was in Lubavitch. So the Greinem, his mom's a younger man, went over to his mashpia and said, what should I do? Call my these big tzaddikim, the Tzadik's children. And there was fire. Fighting in the streets came out. How do I choose? So the Rashdam said to him like this, I'm not going to tell you what to do. I'm going to tell you a story. He told him the following story. That one time that Tzemach Tzedek said a Maimon Chassidus, and in this Maimon Chassidus he contradicted something he says in Eitz Chaim, something he says in Kabbalah, of that Arizal, which is a no-no. You're not allowed to contradict that Arizal. So after the Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek said the Maimon, there was Chazorah, the Chassidim reviewed the Maimon, and by the Chazorah, the question about the Stira, the Eitz Chaim was brought up. Tzemach Tzedek said different Eitz Chaim. And there was a big discussion, and people gave different answers, but everybody was very comfortable leaving the question Hazoy, and they left. The Shmuel Ber said, this question left me no rest. It bothered me. How could the Tzemach Tzedek say Hepech HaNetz Chaim? So I decided I got to find an answer. So I went to one of the brothers. I came into him. He says, you probably hear about the Eitz Chaim. I said, yeah. So he talked to me for a while and he gave me Terutzim. Not bad, but I was still not satisfied and I left. Then I went to a second brother. And I walk and he says, yeah, what do you want? I said, I have a problem with Eitz Chaim. Oh, the Eitz Chaim. And he also talked to me for some time, gave me some clarity. Nice, but I wasn't satisfied and I left. I went to the third brother. And the third brother said, yeah, what can do? I said, the Eitz Chaim. He says, which Eitz Chaim? I told him the Eitz Chaim. He said, oh, yeah. And he also talked to me for a while. He says, 2 o'clock in the morning at this point. I'd been to a few of the different brothers. I never thought to go into the youngest. He was a modern man. He was a businessman. And I see that the light is on. So I was to go to knock on his door, and then I had a premonition. Before I knocked on the door, in those days they didn't have window shades. They had what's called shoibin, shutters. They were outside. And they had slats. And if you could peek through the slats, you could see what's going on inside. And he peeked through the slats, and he saw the Reb Marash sitting by a table, both his head in his hand, and he was totally engrossed in the Eitz Chaim. He was struggling to understand how you can explain the Tzemach Tzedek, but the Arizal. So he knocked on the door. Vereda, who's there? Shmuel Ben. 1 minute, the door opens, the Eitz Chaim is gone, and all over the table there's the stocks, the business pages of Berlin and Paris and London and whatever other countries, stocks and bonds. And the Shmuel Ben says to Rebbe Marash, what do you want? He says, I have a kasha. A kasha in what? In the Maimon. He says, to me? A kasha in the Maimon coming to me? Go to my brothers. So Shmuel Ben says, listen to me. He says, if you help me, it's good. Otherwise, tomorrow morning, the whole of Bahavish is going to know what I saw through the window. Because before I knocked on the door, I looked through the window. So the newspapers went away. And the Eitz Chaim came out. He says, we talked till the morning. And he says, they drank tea. I once heard a version of the story that in the morning, the Rebbe Marash told them exactly how many cups of tea they drank, and at which point in the conversation they had stopped to have another cup of tea. But I don't know. He says, and the clarity that I heard that night, said the Shmuel Ber, the Greinem, I never heard. So he says, I'm staying in Lubavitch. I'm not going to tell you what to do, but he says, you should find your own path. And of course, Greinem chose to stay in Lubavitch. The Rebbe Marash became a Rebbe. He had very, very few Hasidim. Of course, I'm out of time, but the iskashus that existed between the Rebbe Marash and his Hasidim was extraordinary. It was the most special iskashus. They were a few, but they were deeply connected. And this come of a kama sipurim about the relationship between the Rebbe Marash and his Hasidim. The end of the story was that in 1881, 82, there were pogroms all over Russia. They killed thousands and thousands of Jews. And that's why at that time, millions of the Jews immigrated from Russia to America. And unfortunately, from the Jews who emigrated from Russia to America during that time, is kemat gonish geblieben. There's nothing left. So first of all, there was a movement that was called Bilu. It was like the early Zionists. Yeah, Bilu is based, Yankov Lechuven Elcha, House of Jacob, come let us go. It's called Aliyah Rishonah, the first time you had immigration of Jews to Palestine. And the Marash said if the movement of Bilu had added the two words, the Oir Hashem, Beis Yaakov, Chol V'necha, Beir Hashem, I would have joined. But he didn't join. And he said that he's stopping the pogroms. So he went to Moscow, I think. The capital was Petersburg, but he went to Moscow because that was like the business center. And he gathered all the pnei of the Jewish nation in Russia at the time. Most of them were not frum, the big business people, professionals, very successful, powerful people. And then Marash sat with them, and he gave them instructions. You'll do this, and you'll do this. So one of these business people says to Rebbe Marash, Rebbe, with all due respect, we're not Yochsidim. We're Samsaposhnikis. We have our own identity. You don't tell us what to do. With us, you consult. So the Rebbe Marash said to them, that the Megillah says that it says, that when Mordechai suggested to Esther that she should go to Achashverosh, Esther hesitated. So Mordechai said to her, if you will be quiet, maybe she'll find another way to save the Jewish people. Then you're going to be lost. So the Marash said, if you'll help me, it's good. Otherwise, I'll do it myself. He got up, he walked out of the meeting, and he called a few lubabs, a few of his own guys, and they pulled it off. He got young Jewish lawyers. They were not from, they were very, very young. They were just out of law school. And then Marash developed a bond with these people that they would remember for the rest of their lives. 50 years later, they would talk about the few months that they spent with the Lubavitch Rebbe. They were not from, but they were so moved by his personality and his greatness and his wisdom and his understanding and his sensitivity and his pragmatism and the Frierdiker Rebbe says he met an old lawyer who was one of the young lawyers who the Marash had taken instead of all the Pnei. And they pulled it off. How did they pull it off? The Marash came to Petersburg, and he asked to meet the minister who was in charge of state. And he didn't have time for him, he's busy. Jews are dying every day, and he says nothing. The Marash got on a train, he traveled to Berlin, and he met with the community. And there were opinion pages in the largest newspapers in Berlin saying that they should put sanctions against Russia because of the government state anti-Semitism. Then he traveled to Paris and repeated the same performance. He went to a few capitals in the mainland of Europe. He basically blackmailed the Russian government. Got back on a train and went straight back to Petersburg. When he arrived in Petersburg, the city was burning. They wanted to kill him. The Minister of State met him immediately. And he screamed at the Rebbe Marash, this is treason, you undermine the government. And the Rebbe Marash says, Jewish blood is spilling and you have no time for me. So he said to me, no, you could pay for this with your life. So the Rebbe Marash said to him, wegen sich trachte ich in ganz nicht. I'm not thinking at all about my own life, but this is going to stop. And the pogroms stopped. That Erev Rosh Hashanah, he called in his Rebbetzin, the Rebbetzin Rivka. And the Rebbe said in Tafshin and Beis, the Rebbe said, Erev Rosh Hashanah, the Rebbe said that it's known that the Rabbeim had an inyan, that Erev Rosh Hashanah they would call in and speak to their Rebbetzin, and that it was an inyan. Pnini has to do a din from Yichud Malchus of a Nuk. So he called in the Rebbetzin Rivka and he told her, amongst other things, Ich soll haben Laban Beis Aliyas Lamailo, und du wirst haben Laban Beis Aliyas Lamata, which means I'm going to have 32 Aliyas, ascents over there, and you're going to have 30 Aliyas over here. What the Rebbe Marash meant to say was that after his Histalkos, they printed a sefer of his Chassidus called Lekutei Teira Al Gimel Parshias that had 32 Maimorim in it, and the Rebbe Tzedivka would live another 32 years. When he told this to his wife, she started to scream. Was redst du hast noch kleine Kinder? What are you saying? You have little kids. Chayamushka was, I think, 7, the youngest daughter. And the Rebbe Marash said, Azei dav zayin. That's how it has to be. 2 weeks later to the day he passed away. And the mashmos is that he pashut, gave away years. Again, his father said, Vishmol Navi, so it meant he lost 4 years or so. That the pogrom should stop, and the pogroms took a stop. And the end of the story was they took his pocket watch, and into the pocket watch he put a match or a toothpick, so that when the hour handle would reach a certain point, it would stop. And then he called each one of his children from oldest to youngest. One had already passed away. He had 5 children. He had a daughter, Leah, and then Reb Zalman Aaron, and then Rebbe Rashab, and then Menachem Mendel, and then the youngest Chaim Mushka. And he spoke to each one. The Rebbe Rashab was oismensch. The Rebbe Rashab was beside himself. He was so upset. He was mamish zerbrochen. The last person he spoke to was his 7-year-old daughter, Harabonis Chaya Mushka. She was the Friedekebb's Mechatenis there. Her son, Menachem Mendel Horenstein, married the Friedekebb's younger daughter, whose name was Shena. In other words, the Menachem Mendel Horenstein was actually the Friedekebb's first cousin. He married the Friedekebb's daughter. And he said to her, Ich hab dir gedacht für the chuppah. I was supposed to take you to the chuppah. But plans change. This was the story, the Stalkus of the Rebbe Marash. There's more to tell. I'll just finish with one. Maiseleh. I had a Malawid whose name was Rabbi Fuchs. I think his name Shmuel Tzvi, Shmuel Hirsch Fuchs. Maybe I'm saying his name wrong, but his name was certainly Shmuel or someone like Tzvi. I don't know what my schus was. Whenever I would see him, and I'm talking 30 years after I learned by him, literally, he would tell me a story. So one of the stories that he told me was that he heard from Reb Chatzah Fagin. That Reb Chatzah Fagin heard in Lubavitch that there was a Yid, a businessman, who Reb Chatzah Fagin knew. He used to come to Lubavitch at the Rebbe Rashab, who would tell a story. That when this guy was young, he was traveling on a train. You know how it is. The rich people travel first class. The poor people travel third class. And the business people travel what's called second class. Today they call it business class. And he was traveling second class. And in a nearby compartment is another Yid, a Frumer Yid, also traveling business class. So he goes over, he says, Shalom Aleichem. Who are you? My name, I come from Lubavitch. I'm from Lubavitch. Ah, Lubavitch. Why are you traveling? It's business. So this businessman says to his co-traveler that he heard that in Lubavitch there's a controversy because the Rebbe Marash passed away, and that there are two candidates, an older brother and a younger brother. He says, but I have my sources, and they tell me that the younger one is going to be Rebbe. What can you tell me about the younger brother? So this businessman says in Yiddish, was it is it, aber zum Taten kommt nicht. Whatever he is, but he's not his father. That's the point. They come to the next station, and there's hundreds of chassidim waiting on the platform. This businessman gets out of the train. He says, what's this? What are you all doing here? He says, what's hey? So we came to Makal upon the Rebbe. He asked the Rebbe Rashab his opinion of the Rebbe Rashab, you understand? So the Rebbe Rashab said to him, was it is it, aber zum Taten kommt nicht. So he said, this is his damnus. So he got off the train. He took a hotel and he made a yechidus and he went to the Rebbe Rashab to ask H's for business. And apparently he got good advice because for the next 30 years he used to come to Lubavitch. Okay, Kindle, thank you for listening. Thank you for listening and thank you for listening. A gute Nacht. It was on Zugebund, Rabbi Seibner Siyenu. It was Hoben de Gula Shleimet. You know, the Rebbe Marash didn't just say Lechat Chila Rebbe. He was Lechat Chila Rebbe. Everything about his life and his personality was Lechat Chila Rebbe. No, it's as I not Mosai. The Rebbe spoke this time of year. Lama Nigora is a cry for the Gula Shlema. So I'm a pale mamish. Okay, a good nacht, everybody. Be well. Kol Tov Stella. Okay. Okay. Anybody home? Okay, so we're done. Yeah, we're finished. Yeah.